The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
Well, we hope everybody out there had a pretty good week last week and that you're ready to sit back and listen to tonight's episode. Because I gotta say, I think it's going to be a pretty good one.
I'm really excited about this one. I'm excited every week because I love what we do, but I'm especially excited about tonight's episode.
Yeah, so aren't I. And it seems like tonight's episode is going to run a little bit longer than usual. So we're going to skip the usual housekeeping and just dive right in.
All right, I'm going to hit you with a quote to start it off. Our intention creates our reality, wrote Wayne Dyer, the American motivational speaker and author. Dyer was writing about the power of positive thinking, a concept made famous by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale back in 1954. The idea was to manifest positive outcomes and success in your life by practicing positive self-talk. Soon, the idea of intention, related to positive thinking, permeated every aspect of American culture, spawning countless self-help books and motivational speakers. For anyone who's tried it, it does work. But it wasn't much of a leap for people to ask about other types of intention, especially when it came to the paranormal realm. If positive thinking produces positive outcomes, tangible things like a promotion at work or winning an award, why couldn't it work for other aspects of life? Maybe it explained the paranormal. Now, we've talked about this before on the show when we did the episode on tulpas. Intention has become super popular in the paranormal realm. On paranormal cruise ship excursions, for example, it's pretty popular right now to have thought experiments or intention experiments. Things like, let's see what our thought experiment can do as we sail through the Bermuda Triangle. Ghost hunting shows on TV routinely talk about intention when they are advising owners of former prisons or asylums about how to conduct their paranormal investigations. The two ideas go hand in hand. Your intention in a haunted space sets the mood for the entire investigation. But what if a person's intention actually creates a ghost? Is it possible that a family who thinks they live in a haunted house is actually experiencing a haunting because they created it through intention? Now, I don't mean that the family sat around in their living room one night and said, "Hey, let's create a haunting." What I mean is that one family member experiences something they can't explain, tells their family about it, and then at least one other family member, whether they are a skeptic or not, starts to experience things too. This especially comes into play when a haunting doesn't seem to start until years after a family has lived in the same house for a while. Or one family has all kinds of experiences, but then the next family to move in has absolutely none. The question is the family who believes their house is haunted experiencing the spirit of someone who died, or are they subconsciously feeding into a thought form or intention that literally takes on a physical life of its own? And if so, how do you prove that hauntings are merely intentions that have grown to be bigger than anyone anticipated? Well, you do something like the Philip experiment, one of the most spectacular thought experiments ever done. If you've never heard of it, you're in for a real treat. And if you have, perhaps we came across some information that you've never heard before. One of the best things about the Philip experiment is that it didn't happen last year or 10 years ago. It happened in the 1970s, and it culminated with a televised event. You could do a quick YouTube search and find several videos of the televised event, which I actually recommend because it's really cool and I'd like you to see for yourself. So, in 1972, the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, or TSPR, headed by Dr. A.G. Owen, wanted to see if they could create a ghost. Their ultimate goal was to cause an apparition to manifest. Dr. Owen put together a group of 8 everyday people, including himself. None of them claimed to have any psychic abilities. According to the Psi Encyclopedia website, the group members were Dr. Joel Witten, a psychiatrist, Al, who was a self-employed heating engineer, and Lorne, an industrial engineer, as well as Lorne's wife, Andy. There was Bernice, an accountant, and Dorothy, a housewife. Sue, the chairman of the Canadian chapter of Mensa and a former nurse, and Iris, Dr. Owen's wife, who was also a former nurse, were also group members. The youngest group member was a sociology student named Sydney. The first order of business was for Sue to create a story about an aristocratic Englishman who they named Philip Aylesford. Sue spared no details in her fake biography. According to liveabout.com, Sue wrote that Philip, who was born in 1624, lived during the same time as Oliver Cromwell. A staunch Catholic, Philip supported the king. His wife, who was the daughter of a neighboring nobleman, was a beautiful but cold woman named Dorothy. While Philip was out riding one day, checking his estate's boundaries, he discovered a gypsy encampment. There, he spotted a beautiful raven-haired, dark-eyed girl named Margot. Instantly smitten, Philip convinced her to come back to his estate, where he would keep her hidden away in the gatehouse of his family home, Diddington Manor. The gatehouse became their secret love nest until Dorothy discovered Margot. Because Margot was a gypsy, the enraged Dorothy accused her of witchcraft and bewitching her husband. Margot was brought to trial, and Philip, too afraid of the repercussions, stayed silent. Margot was burned at the stake. Driven by guilt and heartbreak, Philip would go out to the battlements of Diddington Manor, which was really more like a castle, and pace back and forth. Then, at the age of 30, he flung himself from the battlements to his death in 1654. Now that his life story was written, remember it's all fiction, each member of the group was expected to memorize it completely. They met as a group and spent hours discussing what sort of person Philip was and what he looked like. Lauren's wife, Andy, sketched a detailed portrait of Philip based on how the group agreed he looked. The group continued to meet every week for one whole year beginning in September of 1972. These first meetings were pretty informal. All they did was sit around a table in a brightly lit room with the sketch of Philip at the center of the table, and the group would just talk about him. Then they would go silent and, as a group, meditate on Philip's existence. They hoped that by simply talking about him with intention and collectively thinking about him, they could cause his apparition to manifest. By the end of that first year, pretty much everyone in the group had begun to believe that Philip had once existed as a real person. However, Philip had not manifested as a spirit. But the group was determined to keep trying. Iris Owen began doing some research, reading papers by psychic researchers C. Brooks Smith, D.W. Hunt, and K.J. Batchelder, and she suggested that the group should try some good old-fashioned seances. But not the type of seances portrayed in movies. Instead, they would conduct seances like people did in the 1800s. They'd sing songs and maintain a relaxed and jolly atmosphere, sometimes even making jokes. They still left the lights on. After just 3 or 4 sessions, things began to happen. Telling Philip that he could respond by rapping on the table, once for yes, twice for no, the group members took turns asking questions, and Philip actually answered. Philip was actually more than happy to communicate, and his responses began to get stronger and stronger. According to liveabout.com, the group asked more and more specific questions, and Philip would rap really loudly in response. And if he felt as though the conversation was moving away from him and that he was being ignored, he'd move the table they were all seated around to refocus their attention back on him. Even though it was on thick carpet, the table would slide from side to side. Sometimes it would raise inches off the ground. Occasionally, it would balance on just one leg and sort of dance around. On a few occasions, when someone from the group arrived late to a session, the table actually shot across the room as if to say, "Hello," or "It's about time you got here." But yes or no knocks weren't the only responses Philip would give. According to SeanceScience.com, Philip would scratch his nails along the underside of the table if anyone mentioned his wife, Dorothy. If someone made a joke he found funny, he'd knock quickly in succession, as if laughing along. When they played music, he'd sometimes keep the beat with his knocks. All the while, the group was firm in their belief that they had created Philip, and that anything he had to say would be corroborated by the biography Sue had created over a year earlier. They tested their theory by asking him yes or no questions directly from that biography. But what was really interesting was when they asked him questions that were not related to his own personal story. They discovered that he could accurately answer historical questions about the time period he supposedly lived in if the group collectively already knew the answer. But if the group was wrong about an historical detail, Philip would also answer incorrectly. For example, when the group asked him if he enjoyed going to chocolate houses in London, he knocked once, very loudly. But chocolate houses didn't actually exist in London until 100 years after Philip's made-up death date. Another example is that one of the group members, who loved cats, asked Philip if he loved cats. This wasn't something that was in his biography at all, but Philip said yes, loudly, anyway. It seemed as though Philip truly was a manifestation of their collective intention. And so they kept the experiment going, believing that eventually they would see him as an apparition. Philip's abilities continued to grow. He would flicker lights on command, even specific lights that they requested. If a group member left the room and went into other parts of the building, Philip would follow them and knock on the walls or the ceiling on command. According to SeanceScience.com, the group began to routinely leave a piece of candy at the center of the table, telling Philip that it was for him. During one session, one of the group members jokingly said that they were going to take Philip's candy, so he better hang on to it. The table suddenly tipped at a 45-degree angle, and the single piece of candy stayed right where it was, at the center of the table. Intrigued, the group recreated the event without asking for Philip's help, and as they tipped the table, the candy slid directly onto the floor. At one point, according to Ranker.com, the table slid so quickly over the carpeted floor during one of their conversations that it got stuck in the doorway. And the whole group didn't even have to be there. Philip would knock and lift the table with as few as 4 group members present. Philip's poltergeist abilities really became apparent in 1974, when the group took a short break from their weekly sessions. Allegedly, several group members began experiencing knocking sounds in their own houses. When the group got back together, it seemed as though Philip was moving closer towards actual manifestation. The group claimed to see a mist forming over the table at one point, and that the table felt statically charged. But still no apparition. And then the group decided to make the Philip experiment public. They invited 50 people to come watch them interact with Philip, and the event was filmed for television. This is the televised event that you could watch on YouTube if you would like to, and it's pretty remarkable. All 8 members are seated around a table with their hands lightly resting on the tabletop. It's Iris Owen who asks most of the questions, and you can clearly hear single or double knocks in response. As a skeptic myself, I thought, initially, well, obviously someone is using their foot to press on some sort of lever that's hitting the underside of the table. Except, as the group begins to sing, Philip causes the table to levitate, and all 8 of them stand up and move with the table as it turns and then slides across the floor several inches. Then it literally upends onto its side. Did I have a split second of thinking, well, they just tipped it over themselves? Yes, I did. But further into the film, they actually flip the table upside down, and they kneel on the floor all the way around it, and the knocks keep happening in response to their questions. So that totally debunked that somebody was hitting the underside of the table, because they flipped it upside down and knelt around it, and there was still knocking coming from the underside of the table in front of the entire audience.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Now, keep in mind that audience was made up of 50 people and a film crew. So I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want to risk their reputation by faking it in front of all those people. According to the Psi Encyclopedia website, Dr. Alan Gauld of the Society for Psychical Research in London analyzed the audio recordings of Philip's knocks and determined that they had a completely different acoustic quality than if a human were knocking on the same table. After the filming, and the experiment was put under the microscope, so to speak, it was basically considered 100% genuine. At least, no one could disprove it. Philip Aylesford, thought form, intention experiment, tulpa, whatever you want to call him, never did manifest as an apparition. And he disappeared completely when the group collectively told him that they had created him, and therefore they could make him go away. But bolstered by their success, and perhaps eager to prove that the experiment could be replicated, the Owen group tried again, this time creating a fictional young woman named Lilith. Lilith, according to her fake biography, was a French-Canadian spy, and they were able to produce results identical to the Philip experiment in just 5 weeks. From there, they moved on to a medieval alchemist, whom they called Sebastian, and a man from the future whom they named Axel. All of their experiments were successes, and that they were able to get these spirits to respond to questions about their made-up biographies. None of them manifested as apparitions. There was even an Australian group based in Sydney who did their own intention experiment. They successfully communicated with a fake entity who they named Skippy. So, what does the Philip experiment tell us? Basically, it tells us that our minds, especially as a collective, are very powerful. Powerful enough to create beings who can manipulate physical objects. It's kind of a scary thought when you think about it. Can it explain poltergeist activity? Sure. But can it explain all hauntings? No, of course not. But I'll leave you with 2 more quotes by Wayne Dyer. You create your thoughts create your intentions, and your intentions create your reality. And you cannot always control what goes on outside, but you can always control what goes on inside. End quote.
It's also interesting.
So interesting. And I think the coolest part for me was that they did get responses, but nothing ever manifested as an apparition. So it doesn't explain all hauntings. It just possibly explains some.
Right.
Very cool.
You know what I thought would have been cool? Is if they would have took it a step further and had eliminated certain people or just had them not come that night and then kind of switch them in and out to see if they noticed that some people had a greater ability with their intentions to get more responses. So you can kind of get an idea of the group who had the most power, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. Well, they did say that they could whittle the group down to just 4 members and still get responses. But I don't think they went as far as what you're saying to really investigate, look into who were those 4 members, and then, like you said, switch them out and see.
It's still a great experiment.
It's really cool.
Now, see, I like things like that.
Well, it's an explanation.
Yes. It is one explanation. Well, I think we mentioned this right back in the beginning of when we started. Amy Bruni, Adam Berry of Kindred Spirits, they did something similar, but they put it together overnight.
Yes.
And they got results from their story of creating this gentleman.
Yeah, it was the Zombie Boy episode.
Yes.
Where there was a location that had a manifestation that they started nicknaming the Zombie Boy, and they didn't know anything about it. So Amy and Adam created a story, and then it started responding with the things that they had been talking about.
Yeah, I found that very interesting.
It's so interesting.
And we'll be back after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? In York, England, while putting in a parking lot for Lloyd's Bank, a rather large fossil known as a coprolite was discovered. Believed to be Viking and over 9,000 years old, the fossil has been housed in the Viking Museum in York since its unearthing in 1972. At 8 inches long and 2 inches wide, the half-pound massive coprolite is believed to be the largest one ever found. It tells us tons about Viking life. Oh, what's a coprolite? That's fancy talk for fossilized human poop. Who'da thunk it?
All right, we're back.
You're not going to talk about giant poop, are you?
No, but now that you mention it, you did say that the petrified poop that they found was 8 inches long and 2 inches wide.
I did.
So you can imagine that when it was fresh, it had to be a couple inches longer and wider.
I had no idea where you were going.
Because you know it's going to dry and shrivel a little bit.
Right.
Jesus, I feel bad for that person's butt. I mean, that was probably worse than passing a kidney stone. You know?
I'm a little concerned that that's what you've spent the last few minutes thinking about.
Probably similar to giving birth.
No. No, it was not. I can say with certainty. All right, well, I'm glad that you're going to be talking about something else. Why don't you get started?
Yeah, my story's coming from New York tonight.
Nice.
There's a tiny island in the middle of the Hudson River that's fairly close to the mainland city of Newburgh, New York. For centuries, the native peoples claimed that the island was haunted. Then, when Dutch explorers and sailors arrived in the 1600s and settled in Fishkill, they quickly believed that the island was protected by the spirits of native peoples, and they told tales of these ghostly sightings. They named the island Palpel, which means wooden ladle in Dutch. But over the years, a legend sprung up with a different origin story. A young girl named Polly Pell was out on the river ice one day with a friend during some unknown year of the past. Suddenly, the ice broke up around them and Polly was stranded on a jagged ice floe. Somehow, she landed safely on the island and was later rescued by her sweetheart, and the island was named after her. But most people don't know the real name of the island. All they know is that a massive haunted castle rises up from the isolated ground like something from a Bavarian fairy tale. Built in 1901, the once imposing castle still exists today, or at least its crumbling facade and derelict rooms still do. The castle builder was Frank Bannerman, and therefore most people know the 6.5-acre island as Bannerman's Island. What most people also might not know is that for centuries, Bannerman's Island was said to be inhabited by a race of goblins. So, it's haunted by apparitions of both people and ghost ships, and it has goblins. But to stick with the history side of things for a bit, the island does have some historical significance as well. According to the Bannerman Island website, colonists set up chevaux de frise, or wooden cribs filled with metal-tipped pointed logs. They sunk them all around the island, in order to puncture the hulls of British ships during the Revolutionary War. But it didn't work because the British sailors used flat-bottom boats to navigate the Hudson. After the Revolutionary War, the island was purchased by William Van Wyck of Fishkill, New York.
It's interesting. I grew up in that area, and the Van Wyck name is pretty much everywhere. Like, there's a bridge in Queens, but the high school in Wappingers Falls is named after the Van Wicks. And there's also a Van Wyck Homestead Museum in Fishkill. But I had no idea that they owned an island out in the middle of the Hudson.
Well, I thought you'd find it interesting since, it was part of Fishkill.
Yeah, that's cool.
Eventually, the Van Wicks sold the island to Mary Taft, and she sold it to Frank Bannerman. And this is where our story really starts. According to the Bannerman Island website, Frank Bannerman was born in Dundee, Scotland in 1851, before his family immigrated to Brooklyn, New York, when he was 3. As a very young man, he began collecting scrap metal from the harbor by dragging a grapple along the bottom. And he turned his scrap metal collecting into a lucrative business by 1865, when he was just 15. Although he had left school 5 years earlier at the age of 10, Frank later won a scholarship to Cornell University. But due to family circumstances, he decided to stay home. Then he started buying every military surplus item that he could get his hands on, including surplus from the Civil War. He traveled extensively, picking up entire lots from auctions in both the Far East and Europe, and then 90% of the surplus from the Spanish-American War. Hudson Valley Magazine says he was most likely the biggest arms merchant in the world at the time, easily filling his 1-block-long 7-floor shop on Lower Broadway. He was such a collector that he even bought 50 rifles and carbines from Sitting Bull's surrendered weapons arsenal after the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. In 1898, he bought everything that he could from the salvaged parts of the USS Maine, which sank in Havana Harbor, Cuba. Hudson Valley Magazine basically credits him with being the originator of the Army-Navy store. He was so successful that in 1917, he sold 6 30-inch naval rifles to the U.S. government for nearly $150,000 profit. But let's back up a little bit. Soon after opening his Manhattan business at the age of 15, Frank officially changed his name to Francis, since he thought it sounded more genteel. And in 1872, at the age of 21, he married Helen Boyce, who he met while on a shopping trip in Ireland. And with the Spanish-American War surplus purchase, the city of New York told him that he needed to find a place outside of the city to store all of his stuff. They were extremely worried that if the place caught on fire, it could obliterate Brooklyn. While canoeing down the Hudson River one day in the year 1900, Bannerman's son David caught sight of a little unassuming island just 4 miles from West Point. It would be the perfect place for storing all of his father's overwhelming haul of surplus military goods. Bannerman promptly bought the island from Mary Taft, and a year later began building his armory. But not just any run-of-the-mill armory. Bannerman built a castle. Now remember, he was originally from Scotland, and during his world travels, he had come to love castle architecture. So he put pretty much every type of castle architecture he could into his armory. Bavarian-style battlements, Scottish-style embrasures, Italian-style pediments. He included all of it.
What's an embrasure?
Well, embrasures are the typical tooth-like decorations on the tops of castle walls and towers for archers to shoot through.
Oh, so like those little thingies where there's like slits in between up at the top so they could hide behind them and then shoot in between them?
Right.
Aha, okay.
He also constructed a breakwater and harbor around the island by sinking several tugboats and using thousands of Springfield rifles as rebar. I found that just unbelievable. All those Springfields.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's sad.
Just sunk in the water. But I guess he had plenty of extras.
I guess so. The castle boasted 2 turrets that guarded the harbor, and leading to the castle's front door was a working drawbridge. Despite all of that, Bannerman didn't spend a chunk of his fortune on building the castle like you'd expect. He didn't hire a fancy architect or pay experienced builders or craftsmen. Instead, he hired local farmers and workmen and instructed them to build it all out of brick, covered in a layer of whitewashed cement. But don't let that fool you into thinking that it looked like some cheap cardboard cutout of a building. It looked, and still looks, like a genuine medieval European castle. On one side, he installed 4-foot-tall letters that spelled out Bannerman's Island Arsenal and the company's Manhattan address. Inside, he filled every nook and cranny with military items and began printing catalogs to advertise everything that he had. To this day, his catalogs are considered collector's items themselves, and serious modern-day military memorabilia collectors use it as the go-to guide for tracking down authentic items. The Bannerman family didn't live in the castle. It was built specifically to house his overflow of stuff. Instead, he had workers construct a mini-castle of sorts as a summer home for his family. Helen Bannerman was an avid gardener, and she covered the island in manicured lawns. She added a variety of shrubs and flowers and added terraces. Bannerman himself hoped that his armory would one day be known as the Museum of Lost Arts, because, ironically, he was kind of a pacifist. He went to church every week, according to the official Bannerman Island website, and he founded the Caledonian Hospital. During World War I, he gave blankets, uniforms, and cannons to the war effort. And yet, one of Bannerman's employees, who happened to be an Austrian immigrant, was arrested on suspicions of spying, according to the comprehensive article, Bannerman Island and the Improbable Ruined Castle on the Hudson, by Susan Spellin. And so in April of 1918, Bannerman watched a U.S. Navy submarine chaser approach his island fortress. 19 naval officers stepped ashore, and before Bannerman could protest, they seized control, claiming that Bannerman himself could be a German spy, or at the very least, he could be harboring one. As the officers searched the entire island for any kind of evidence of espionage, Bannerman was held under house arrest. Enraged by the mere thought of anyone questioning his patriotism, Bannerman had his lawyer send a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, who happened to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, demanding that the Navy leave his island. Roosevelt apologized and the officers left. But the whole ordeal put a strain on him, and 7 months later, Frank Bannerman passed away at the age of 68. Local papers said that his sudden death was brought on by overwork. His sons took over the business, but it quickly became more than they could handle. Just 2 years later, in 1920, his castle experienced the first of several unfortunate events. Despite everyone claiming for years that Bannerman's castle was in danger of exploding at any moment, there had never been a problem. But then, either due to the summer heat or a possible lightning strike, 200 pounds of black gunpowder exploded. The blast blew out every single window on the island. The explosion also took down a few of the castle's towers as well, and launched a 20-foot-long piece of brick and concrete 1,000 feet, where it landed on New York Central train tracks, shutting down the train for an entire day.
That had to have been one heck of an explosion. They probably heard that, like hundreds of miles away?
Quite possibly. I mean, 200 pounds of black gunpowder. And then a 20-foot-long piece of brick and concrete?
Just goes sailing.
It must have looked like a meteorite coming into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
That had to be just incredible to see.
And lucky that nobody was hurt or killed.
Luckily, it went onto a train track, and there wasn't a train coming at the time.
Right.
Helen Bannerman narrowly missed being literally squashed by falling debris. The hammock that she had been lounging in just seconds before the explosion was buried under rubble. Bannerman's sons felt that it was safer if they focused the business more on catalog sales and less on storing copious amounts of obscure and exotic explosive materials from that point on.
Can't really blame them.
Nope, it was a good move. Their business plan changed again in 1950, when the state and federal government banned the sale of military weapons to civilians, and so the armory was emptied out. The brothers, well, they kept what they could still safely sell, and then they got rid of the rest. Empty now, and pretty much abandoned, the castle just wasn't constructed well enough to handle the harsh extremes of New York weather, and it began to decay and crumble at an alarming rate. That same year, the only ferry boat that made the trip to the island sunk in a storm. So pretty much all visitations to the castle disappeared. Even the caretakers dwindled away. By 1958, the castle armory was officially decommissioned, and all the remaining explosives were removed from the disintegrating outbuildings. Since both Bannerman's sons had passed away by this time, Frank's grandson sold the island to the state of New York. A decade later, in 1969, a fire that burned over 78 hours destroyed most of the buildings, leaving the castle little more than a ruin. Most recently, in December of 2009, an estimated 35 feet of the castle's entire front wall and east corner wall collapsed. Today, Bannerman's Island is still owned by New York State and is cared for by the Bannerman Castle Trust. Volunteers have painstakingly worked on restoring as much of the original castle as they can, relying on fundraising events in order to do so. They offer various daytime tours and some cool events like outdoor dining, weddings, and live theater, including a production of Dracula, which I think is pretty cool.
Well, to see Dracula at a ruined castle?
I know.
That's cool.
I know. It'd be awesome to go at night.
Yeah.
But now, let's get to the hauntings and the goblins.
I forgot about the goblins.
I know, I did go on quite a bit. I know everybody's thinking, well, what about the goblins?
Yeah, but the history is interesting. It's cool.
Oh, it's awesome. And you have to know about the history. So, historically, the part of the Hudson River where Bannerman Island is located is known for violent storms and howling winds. But here's where the story gets a little complicated. Allegedly, due to being a superstitious bunch, the Dutch sailors back in the 1600s and into the 1700s believed that the bad weather around the island was caused by the Heer of Dunderberg. Basically, the Hudson River flows between a mountain range known collectively as the Hudson Highlands, and the mountains were home to a band of hidden people, otherwise known as imps or goblins, who weren't the nicest creatures. But their Heer king was the nastiest of them all. They called him the Heer of Dunderberg. Dunder is Dutch for thunder, and Berg is Dutch for mountain, and he lived quite comfortably on Palpel Island. The Heer of Dunderberg controlled the weather, summoning up storms to smash passing ships. If you wanted safe passage, there were a few things that you could do as you left Peekskill Bay. Number 1, everyone on board could tip their hat toward Dunderberg. Number 2, you could tie a horseshoe to the mast. If you failed to do either thing, the Heer of Dunderberg would call on the power of nature to sink your ship and drown your men. But what if the Heer was too busy and he didn't see you all tip your hats? Well, he would simply send out the ghost ship, crewed by his goblin army. Now, where it gets complicated is that the only written account about the Heer of Dunderberg was written by Washington Irving, the same Washington Irving who wrote the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And historians point out that Irving kind of made up stuff and claimed it was actual legend. But ghost ships are actually seen around Bannerman Island. There are stories where people on the island have heard calls of distress, and when they look out at the Hudson, they swear the calls are coming from a ship that is sailing past, even though they can't see anything. This is especially common during storms. Strange lights seem to bounce off the water as well, as though a ship is passing by. And again, there is actually no ship to see. There are also stories of people seeing what look like phantom apparitions of sailors on actual real ships that pass by as well. And there are reports of the sound of phantom cannon fire. So, could these quite possibly be residual haunts from the Revolutionary War days? Or could it be part of the tugboat's captain's revenge? Remember how I said Frank Bannerman sank several tugboats around his island in order to create a breakwater? Well, there's one story about an old tugboat captain who was sad to say goodbye to his boat. He begged Frank Bannerman to wait until he was off the island before he sank it, because he didn't want to witness her demise. Bannerman allegedly didn't listen to the old captain and gave the order for the tugboat to be sunk right then and there. The distraught captain swore revenge, and people say that to this day, you can often hear the sound of the tugboat's bell, reminding Bannerman of what he did. Does that sound like just more legend and lore about Bannerman Island? Well, quite possibly so. But after taking one look at Bannerman's castle in person, as dusk falls, you might change your mind.
That's a cool story.
It is a cool story. I liked it. That's why I did it.
Such incredible history there. It's just, I don't know, it's really cool.
Well, if the story about the tugboat captain is true, that's just sad. I mean, that's pure evil.
Yeah, it doesn't reflect very positively on Frank Bannerman's character.
Not at all.
But, people will say all kinds of things about successful businessmen.
And I love stories of ghost ships.
I know you do. This was right up your alley.
I know. Well, if any of you listeners out there have ever been to Bannerman Castle, drop us an email. We'd like to hear about any of your experiences.
I can't believe I lived there for so long and I never even knew about it. I keep telling you, I did not have much of a interest in this type of stuff when I was a teenager, other than it all scared me. So, yeah, I never even knew it was there.
Yeah, look at all that you missed out on.
A lot, I know. And actually, in all fairness, my parents took me all over the place to see all kinds of historical buildings and places and battlefields, and I'm not complaining. Not really.
Kind of sounds like you are. Are you worried that your parents are listening?
No, I just don't want anybody to get the wrong impression. It's just not one of the places that I knew of. I'm sure my parents are happy because as a teenager, the last thing they would have wanted me to do was to go out to this island with a bunch of my friends.
And see a cool ghost ship? Now that I think about it, in a lot of your travels, you missed out on some cool places that were quite adjacent to where you were that you never knew about.
I know. It's a good thing I met you and I expanded my knowledge of the world.
Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up, yes. I agree with you. Well, with that said, you want to tell them about the sources?
Yeah, speaking of wrapping it up. If you would like to know more about Bannerman Island or about the Philip experiment, you can always check our sources in our show notes. As I promised, the link is there to one of the many YouTube videos of the Philip experiment. And if you have a chance, check out the castle and look at the interior pictures. The place was pretty amazing when it was full of stuff. Or so my husband tells me. No.
All you got to do is believe anything I tell you. I would never steer you wrong. Well, with that said, join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.